Welcome to the roundtable on Washington's proposed gun bills. Before we dive into discussing some of these proposed gun laws, let's get to know some of our participants here. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I want to start out with Moms Demand Action Representative Tom Dwyer. We had a bit of a schedule conflict, so we're happy that you were able to make it here today, Tom. And joining him is a representative from Students Demand Action Spokane, Mattia Moore. Thank you for being here. And here on the other side, we have sharpshooting indoor range and gun shop manager Jeremy Ball, as well as the president of Washington State Firearms Coalition, Melissa Denny. Thank you guys for being here today.
Thank you.
Now I want to start out with kind of a bigger picture question. We'll start on this side with you, Mattia. What does gun control mean to you?
Personally, I think gun control to me means more, one thing that I know Students Demand Action stands for a lot is we don't want to completely get rid of, we want regulation, we want to be safe. We want to be able to feel safe in wherever we are without having to worry about that.
Great. And Tom, for you as well, what does gun control mean to you?
First and foremost, not taking away guns, but more importantly, having sensible gun laws surrounding the ownership of those weapons. And so I think that for me, maybe the best way to put it boils down to need a license to drive, need a license to sell insurance or securities, fly a plane, whatever the case. Why not have training and licensing for weapon ownership?
Okay. Melissa?
For me, it means keeping her safe also. It means common sense. It also means not taking away the right of people who are responsible owners because it has no effect on criminal activity.
And Jeremy, what does gun control mean to you?
So I think that term gun control gets used incorrectly a lot, that we want to control the actions of citizens and the way that they experience their lives or make the choices that they do. And firearms ownership is a fundamental right of each individual person here in the United States. And I believe that if we continue to regulate an inanimate object, we are going to eventually go down the road of completely eliminating firearms from our culture.
So Tom, we'll start with you on this next question. Why is this issue important to you? Do you have a personal story that makes it important?
I don't think I would characterize myself as a victim of gun violence or a survivor. I do have a relative that shot himself who was a suicide. So I was affected by that and attended the funeral, and that was very difficult to do. But I own a gun. My wife and I purchased a gun about 10 years ago for protection in our home. And my brother-in-law went with me, who I would consider a gun expert. He collects and likes to take them apart, put them back together. He's an enthusiast. And so I utilized him in helping me choose a gun. And I went through a background check in Arizona where I bought the gun. It was at, I think, Bass Pro Shops. You know, it was a pretty innocuous event, not a lot of drama to it. The background check took about 10 minutes, no big deal. But had he not been there, I thought about it in thinking about what I might say during this roundtable. Had he not been there, I walk out of there with a gun, which I appreciate. I was able to go into a shop in Arizona and actually buy a gun. It wasn't hard to do. But when I walked away from the store with my gun, had I not had his expertise, I wouldn't know how to load it, clean it, take it apart, fire it, whatever the case is. I never had a gun before. You know, I'm not a gun enthusiast, I'm not a hunter, but I wanted this gun, and I appreciate the fact that I could go and buy it. But it felt very much lacking in terms of the training and the ability to know how to utilize it, clean it, take care of it, and so on.
And Mattia, why is this issue important to you?
Well, I got involved with Students Demand Action shortly after the Freeman shooting when our group really started to do stuff in Spokane. And a big motivating factor for why I wanted to is my mom, when she was younger, she was shot at by somebody affiliated with her family. And I don't know, I think a lot about if there were stricter gun laws and just gun sense legislation back then, how it would affect my life just differently.
Thank you. Melissa, why is this issue important to you?
I think there's a lack of communication and a lack of education. I think that the education portion is really, really large in the respect of the training. Out of 2.5 million deaths annually on average in the United States, there were about 400 firearms discharges that were accidental. And in those, almost zero death or harm done. So intrinsically, people have a desire to survive, and they have a desire to not handle something that is a deadly weapon, whether it be a car or a kitchen knife or whatever that may be, and to learn how to use it. It's, as you sought out, you're expert. I also am a firearms dealer. I've had about 20,000 people through my store, literally, in the last 7 years. And I listen to and help people start from the very first day. I have people come in all the time that are brand new. They really don't want to take something home that they don't understand. So there is a desire in wanting to understand how the machine works. It's really not something that people just take home and hope for the best. Throw it in their purse and go, gosh, I hope this goes okay. They take it out and do what they're supposed to be responsible. So.
Thank you, Melissa. Jeremy?
I think to add on to what Melissa said too is that education comes in a lot of different packages now, particularly with the internet. People use education sources like YouTube and all kinds of other enthusiast websites that help people to understand the item significantly better than they did 10 years ago when they go to make that first purchase. So we find with our customer base, they're incredibly well educated. They know exactly what they're looking for, exactly what type of firearm or exactly what the need is for that gun. And they have done endless amounts of research on that particular firearm. And we find that they do that same thing as it results in training as well. And so we do teach firearms education classes, and that is definitely a cornerstone of our organization. But the amount of education that is available to people just in general out online is so significant, and also we see so many people taking advantage of it. And so it's I don't think that you find very many gun owners that are flippant about the educational side of owning a firearm.
Sounds like kind of a consensus of education is a priority among you guys, for sure. Well, let's dive into it. We're going to start by discussing Senate Bill 6294. That's regarding mandatory concealed pistol license training, specifically requiring concealed pistol license holders to show proof of 8 hours of gun safety training. There's a little bit more to that, but that's the gist. We'll start on this side here. Melissa, how will this law, how do you think this proposed bill will change anything?
I think it will make it very difficult for elderly people. I think it will make it difficult for people who are disadvantaged, for people who don't live in an area that there is an opportunity for a range. In Seattle, there is nowhere to train. And people have to seek it out and go on their own, which if they've been doing this their whole life already, it's kind of redundant in that you have more firearms in the country now than you've ever had, and less crime. The statistics do not support that things are getting worse, they're getting better. So in order for that to happen, there is more responsibility in the firearms ownership of the people who purchase them. So I think that to disadvantage people who may not have the means or the opportunity or the transportation, or because they're elderly or because they're in an area where that's not available, they have these other resources or they have their friends, then they do seek out this training. So I think it's cumbersome, and I think it's picking on disadvantaged people, truly.
Jeremy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the other thing to continue, I agree with Melissa. The other part of this is the logistical side behind the training in general. We have roughly about 400,000 people that have concealed weapons permits in Washington State, and if you look at into the particulars of this bill, one of the aspects of it requires a live fire proficiency test. The amount of shooting ranges that are even available for people is going to cause a massive problem on the logistical side of training. And if you follow this bill specifically, every 5 years it's going to require them to go through that training again. At the rate in which we're issuing concealed weapons permits in Washington State, it's not sustainable. So getting the people that already have concealed weapons permits through this on their renewals is not going to, there's just basically not enough space. And unfortunately, the licensing and startup time for shooting ranges within the state is so cumbersome that the industry is not going to be able to react to that.
I'll give you guys an opportunity to respond, but I do want to follow up with that. Can't you argue that there are benefits, though, to having some kind of training before using a firearm?
I absolutely agree with that. Yeah, you should have some training.
Yes.
Absolutely. My objection to this is that state mandated training is very, depending on how far you get into the particulars of this, the biggest issue behind the mandated training is that they're going to tell us exactly what we can and cannot teach, and they're going to provide information that's likely out of date by the time they release it. The training environment evolves very, very quickly as firearms platforms change over time, as safety systems develop differently, and as we learn things. And so the state will not have the ability to evolve fast enough and will likely be teaching out-of-date material very, very quickly.
Well, and just to interject on the 1639 legislation that was passed back in July that made mandatory training for the assault rifles, that now everyone has to come in with a certificate that says that they've gone through training. There's no training. It's a legal lesson. There's nothing, it doesn't tell you anything about how to properly handle a firearm. It's called safety training, but it's safety training in the respect that these are the legal ramifications of improper storage or where you are allowed to take your firearm and where you're not allowed to take your firearm. It doesn't teach you how to shoot a firearm. It doesn't talk to you about the logistics of the machine. And for whatever it's worth, these machines are really simplistic in their entirety. They're not nearly as complex as a vehicle. There's not a lot to know about them, and anybody can figure them out very quickly. So,
Great. Tom, would you like to respond?
Well, I understand your responses, and I don't necessarily disagree because I don't know all about the infrastructure that's available that can support and purvey the training that this bill would require. However, I think it does sort of dovetail into a different discussion perhaps that's connected, and that is how many different ways people can buy guns. You can buy them online, you can buy them through Craigslist at a gun show or going to a retailer, much like what you operate. And for me, in terms of a safety issue, that's part of the problem, is that how easy it is to buy a gun and how easy it is for somebody to be in a position of not knowing how to handle it. So I don't know if there are some states, much like liquor laws, and I think in Idaho you have to buy your liquor at a state liquor market. And maybe that's the direction that gun sales have to go, is you sell guns, you purvey training, you offer education, sounds like to a very, very large and complete degree, which I appreciate. But if I can go online and buy a gun from somebody on Craigslist, or at a gun show where there's supposed to be background checks, but it's not enforced and there's no teeth in that law, how is somebody going to get that required education and training in operating a firearm?
I wonder if you can speak more to what impact you think requiring CPL holders to have proof of 8 hours of gun safety training, what impact that will have on gun violence?
Well, the statistics I've read is that those states that do mandate that you go through the training program have seen decreases in casualties and fatalities. So if those states have seen that and it's a proven statistic, it's hard to argue with that.
I'll give you guys a chance to respond. Mattia, do you have anything to add?
Just that I definitely see the logic behind what you guys are saying, but also, I guess, also what Tom was saying about the amount of different ways, I guess, you can get it, and if because of the training that you guys have been talking about, But if there's, like he was saying about Craigslist and there's so many other ways, then I feel like there's got to be some sort of way we can, I guess, enforce more, like you need to get this training, just because though most people, as she was saying, they want to know how to use it, but I think there's still always going to be that number of people who are going to get it in those other ways.
That maybe don't get training? Is that what you're saying? Would you like to respond?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, if you buy a firearm online, particularly through a retailer, an auction site, that firearm doesn't get shipped to your front door. Okay. You can't buy a gun on the internet from an organization and have it shipped to you. It goes directly to a retailer that has an FFL that conducts a background check and runs through all required Washington state and federal regulations. The fact that people have, or that do buy firearms in a manner in which is not legal under Washington state law currently is not going to be changed by a training requirement for concealed weapons permit holders. 594 and originally Initiative 594 and Initiative 1639 basically prevented the sale of firearms through private parties in the state of Washington. It's already under federal law illegal for you to go buy a firearm from a private party over state lines. So I totally agree with you. We're on the same page here. This bill that's currently in the Senate, though, it does not touch or will have zero impact on this particular issue because the concealed weapons permit holders are not the people that are buying firearms illegally.
And again, kind of reiterating the fact that we all agree here that training is a good benefit. It is something I'd like to see, but wonder, CPL holders is only 10% of Spokane County population. So why only require that for that small population rather than all folks that may want to purchase a firearm? Because you can purchase a firearm without a CPL.
I definitely think that this bill, as a lot of bills, aren't perfect, and I think there's definitely something that needs to be put into place that could help with those other issues. Maybe this bill isn't that, but I definitely think there needs to be some sort of thing that will deal with this.
Tom, would you like to?
Well, I would say why not indeed? Why not have mandatory education for all gun purchases?
I think in response to just quickly to touch on both of those things, the gun shows, they're all going through firearms dealers. Everyone with a CPL has gone through the steps to have a background check with the FBI and their local law enforcement. Now they are waiting for delivery for several days while there's an extensive background done. If those people already have a CPL, they are already showing that they're responsible. Anybody can put a gun on their person and walk out the front door without a license. Those are the people that are probably going to be a little less responsible than the people who are seeking out that license to carry. So you're taking kind of the upper echelon of the firearms owners and creating an intrinsic hardship on them. Is there something can be done with some training and opportunity? That's something we should explore. Is the CPL holder the right target? Pardon that, it's not no pun intended. I don't think so. I think we're wasting resources. Personally, I think a lot of this, as we get through this, is going to, I think we're wasting a lot of time and resources, and we could find some things to better place them. That's my opinion.
Last thing on this, when 1639 passed, there is a training requirement. Unfortunately, there is no way for anyone to check whether or not that training requirement has actually been met. So, for example, if an individual has Microsoft Word on their computer, they can make a certificate. And that certificate, if they bring that to a firearms dealer, there is no mechanism in place for a firearms dealer to check whether or not that certificate is valid. The state of Washington is not set up to do that, and so the validity of those certificates is really a moot point. And again, you come back to, if someone is going to be a criminal, they're going to be a criminal. There's nothing that there's not amount of legislation that you can write that is going to stop someone from breaking the law if their intent is to break the law.
I want to ask one more question to the group before we move on to the next bill. As I mentioned, I talked to Spokane County Sheriff Ozzie Knezevich about this bill in particular as far as the law enforcement take on this. And he said law enforcement generally trust CPL holders because they've already taken, I believe Melissa mentioned this, they've already taken that first step in following the law to legally conceal carry. And because he mentioned they have helped stop crimes in the past. So I wonder what you all say to this. Matai, if you'd like to start.
I do think that, thinking over if the CPL, I guess they have already, taken that step following the law by, I guess, going through that step. So like she was saying, like maybe those are people we can trust more. I think like we've been talking about gun violence is caused by a couple more, like a different group. But
Yeah, I would agree that taking that step is a certain type of qualifier for someone with an interest in firearms and their expertise in handling one. But the information I've read indicates that, again, I think I mentioned this before, those states that have implemented the requirement have seen decreases in casualties. And it's hard to argue with that statistic.
Would you like to respond?
So I think that the casualty statement is interesting there because right now we're currently tracking deaths of firearms to include suicides. And if we remove that out of that equation, the question is does that training actually have an impact on reducing the amount of deaths by firearm within states? In Washington state, we're running at about an 80 to 85% of all firearms deaths in the state of Washington are suicide related.
Right.
And that's a problem.
Right.
And you'll find no debate from any of us within this industry as that being an issue. But again, training isn't going to necessarily negate that issue. In conjunction with other states finding a decrease with the specific, with concealed weapons permit holders, I'm not sure that there's actually an organization that's been able to develop a statistic on that is not an influencer group in some way, and it's not, because DOJ doesn't do that and the FBI doesn't do that, and so I'm not sure that there's actually any credible evidence to show that this training is going to automatically reduce the amount of firearms deaths.
So there actually is, the CDC does track it. And in this big document that I gave you guys to take a look at, those numbers are in there. There are 400 across the country in the entire United States of accidental, you're talking about accidental discharge. The training is not to teach you about target practice, it's about teaching you how to not accidentally discharge your firearm in an unsafe manner. So when you're looking at numbers, those numbers are tracked by the CDC, and they are in those reports. I would like to see what the states have done in order, like you said, to isolate that number, because these numbers are very discombobulated. And when you look at the CDC is what I have found to be the most cohesive report in there's 122 pages of how people die annually. It's daunting. It's kind of depressing when you get done, to be honest.
Yep.
But when you look at firearms related deaths in particular, and then you start extrapolating suicide and mental illness, I'll never get over this, is where we need to be putting some resources. I feel that's where we could make a difference. No person who is mentally stable would harm another human being. Humans are fabulous. They are kind and considerate. They'll give you the shirt off their back, the shoes off their feet, the last dollar in their wallet. They come together in crisis. Humans don't harm each other. They don't threaten each other's gift of life. It's not a thing.
I do want to wrap up before we move on to the next bill, give each side an opportunity just to say in concise, why should Washington State support Senate Bill 6294, and I assume not support from this side. So Tom, would you like to start?
Sure. Again, I think my overriding thought and commentary has to do with more education, more training. It can't hurt. Statistics bear out the fact that it does help in reducing casualty rates. I understand there's lots of ways to massage and manipulate statistics and numbers, and the ones that I'm leaning on could be victims of that. I don't know, but those are the ones that I can lean on. And again, I think that if somebody's buying a gun, they should know exactly what they're dealing with, how to handle it, how to clean it, how to take it apart, load it, unload it, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Thank you. Melissa, Jeremy, would one of you like to respond?
I'd like to take a look at those statistics, because
Sure.
I think that one of the biggest principles for my foundation is that we have real numbers and we talk about real data. Data has no feelings. It doesn't care. It just is. So if we can look at those things and you can show that there is some sort of improvement in an area, then let's have an open conversation about that. And I would love to see what those sources are that you're citing, and then look at where they're coming from.
Sure.
So kind of in concise, why should Washington State support this bill or not support this bill?
Like I said, it's a wasted resource for something that's really not a problem. It's a minuscule number in the scheme of things, and we could put some resources and legislation behind some things I feel would make a difference.
Now we will discuss House Bill 1374. In short, it focuses on allowing local authority to regulate firearms. I'm just going to read here briefly just an excerpt from that bill, just to kind of get us all on the same page. HB 1374 provides local jurisdictions the ability to build upon statewide standards and adopt responsible approaches to firearms regulations to help address the epidemic of firearm violence in their communities by restoring inherent local authority to adapt firearm regulations under the police power to protect public health, safety, and welfare. We'll start out on this side for this question. How will this law change anything?
Well, as I understand the law, it allows certain localities who are susceptible to a high index of gun violence to have resources targeted to that group. Those resources are used for education. Some of the information that I saw indicated cure violence, where it treats gun violence as a disease. Violence intervention, where patients are engaged while in the hospital, if it's a street group or a gang of some kind. If there's retaliation that's on the horizon, vindication, whatever the case might be, that those folks can be or experience an intervention and hopefully prevent that. Again, statistics that I've read and have seen indicate that these are helpful intervention methods that reduce gun violence and reduce casualties.
I want to follow up with that. I spoke with Sheriff Knezevich about this law as well. From a law enforcement standpoint, he said it could be confusing to enforce. He says it would be difficult for people and officers to keep track of what might be allowed in Spokane versus another city or county you might be visiting. I wonder what you say to that.
I think I would agree with that. If this is implemented, if the law is passed and the programs are implemented, I can see how anything that's new and different is going to be confusing at first. So whether things are different in Spokane versus a pocket of gang violence in Seattle, obviously there's differences there, and how those situations are handled are going to be different.
Would you like to respond as well?
Yes. I definitely think that though it can be confusing at first, I mean, a lot of things, I guess a bill like this, because it can differ from place to place, it can be seen as confusing, like it could cause some conflict between like setting, I guess, for law enforcement. But I mean, overall, if there is also that little bit of freedom for that, because there are so many different settings and places in Washington and any state, it could be more beneficial, because they could, instead of having just one overall thing for all areas of Washington, there could, with, I guess, areas with higher rates of gun violence or things relating to that, there could be different regulations based on different areas, because maybe some place with a smaller number won't need as much regulation as some place with a high rate of gun violence. Would you like to respond, Melissa? We'll start with you.
So it's a double-edged sword in that you're talking about regulation between Spokane and Seattle. There's a lot of miles between those two areas. There are how many cities and counties in the state? And you're talking about preemption gives them the opportunity to write different legislation across every city line. Every time you drive down the street in my area, there's I mean, 5 miles is the difference between where I'm sitting and 3 towns around me. So if each of those have different regulations, how am I ever going to, as a CPL holder, abide by the law if I don't know what the law difference is in every place I travel? It could very well, I think, become just a muddy mess. And in the gang violence, in the criminal element is where I feel resources could very well be placed. There should be some very strict consequences. I mean, if you know that the consequence isn't worth it, there needs to be deterrent. There's just too many people that go do something and then are out on the street in no time flat. I have had 2 instances in my store that I've had 2 sets of young boys come in with the intent to commit armed robbery. I have a jewelry store, and that is a very dangerous world in some places. So these young men, one of them had been in prison for 9 years and was out. He had killed somebody in the commission of an armed robbery. He was out in 9 years. Why is that young man in my store? Why does he have a firearm in his belt or in his pants when he's not supposed to have one? He robbed 5 businesses in my area before he retreated back to Los Angeles. Now, the reason he didn't rob my store, and I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, because we had this conversation, everyone in my store is armed. We have open carry, and more than half of my staff is military, retired military. Everyone is very well trained. The presence of those firearms made it so that they had no interest in committing a crime in that location.
Jeremy, do you want to add to any concerns you might have about this bill?
Yeah, I look at this from just from a business standpoint, and again from a logistical standpoint. So currently, right now, Washington State is having Washington State law enforcement agencies are having to conduct background checks based on a person's residence. And so there's 257 municipalities in Washington State that are currently conducting background checks on behalf of Washington State firearms dealers. And so every time we submit a background check, we have to determine who is actually responsible for doing that. So one quick example is in Spokane County. So if you live in Spokane County outside of the Spokane city limits, your background check actually doesn't go to the county, it goes to the city. And the purpose from that is because you've got the county contracting to the city. When you look at an area that is like Seattle, there is tons and tons of contracting back and forth. So figuring out where these background checks even go is fairly difficult, and it's a daunting task. Now, if we allow each municipality to start implementing their own firearms regulations, how is a dealer supposed to stay compliant, ensuring that I can sell a firearm to someone that lives in another municipality? How can I keep that straight? And if you look at the firearms industry as a whole, there are just too many options out there, too many different things. And so piecing that stuff together, it would be virtually impossible for a dealer to stay in compliance. And then from a concealed weapons permit holder to understand the regulations of all the different counties and cities within Washington State, being in compliance in some cities and then not being in compliance in others, how would they be able to even transport themselves or the firearm to those different places?
All right. We're going to go to break here. Thank you guys for answering those questions. We're going to quick break here, and when we come back, we'll discuss the proposed ban on magazines with a capacity of more than 10 rounds. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We'll continue our roundtable discussion on Washington proposed gun bills here in the legislative session this year. We're going to discuss Senate Bill 6077. It focuses on banning magazines with a capacity of more than 10 rounds of ammo. I want to start on this side with Tom. How do you think this would make people safer?
Well, as I was speaking to Jeremy about, I got involved in this group, Moms Demand Action, as did my wife, shortly after the Stoneman Douglas shooting, and shortly thereafter, I think it was the Las Vegas shooting. So my feeling is that any person with any weapon that has the ability to fire off more than 10 rounds in this example, or more, very quickly and easily, and kill masses of people in the, I don't want to say the blink of an eye, but in a couple of minutes. If we can do something to stop that, that would be great. I think the gun that I own can hold 8 rounds. It seems like plenty for my purposes. If someone breaks in my house, if I want to take that person down, I can make that happen with 8 rounds. It's hard for me to get my head around somebody that wants to have a reason or has a need to fire off more than 10 rounds. To that end, I would liken the discussion to me saying, I want a tank. Well, I can't have a tank. That's illegal. I want an urban assault vehicle. I can't have that. I want a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher. I can't have that. You know, at some point, it doesn't make sense that certain weaponry that's out there is in the hands of most anybody, or anybody that finds it easy to buy and legal to buy.
And maybe Ty, you can respond to this, but what do you say to those who go shooting just for sport?
Personally, it's hard for me to comprehend why somebody would, I guess, enjoy inflicting violence for sport. Though I get, everybody has their different interests, everybody understands things differently, enjoys themselves in a different way. But personally, I think if somebody has those type of interests, they should be able to do that. Everybody should be able to do what they enjoy. I just think legislation is it just needs to be regulated, I think, a little bit.
I'll let you guys respond to that. Jeremy, do you want to start?
Yeah, so currently, right now, Washington State does not have a capacity limit on magazines. Magazines are a unserialized, untrackable, untraceable item that is that by banning but allowing possession of within the state, or you to retain possession, will allow people to acquire more of them because they'll just do so out of state. And there's no tracking mechanism in place, and there's basically all you're doing is just harming the retailers that sell these products, because again, you're just going to push the business outside the state of Washington, so the state will lose the tax revenue and the businesses will lose the opportunity and profitability of those sales supporting the people that work for them. So as from a result of firearms violence, there are some very, very unique circumstances that we've seen where more rounds are used in a particular violent encounter. Tom mentioned the Stoneman Douglas shooting, and I don't recall the exact amount of rounds that were fired at that, but we have also seen numerous altercations that have happened in states like California that banned what they call high capacity magazines decades ago, and they are still using those in the midst of these crimes. We've also seen other shootings that people have had 10-round magazines and done even more damage by just being able to reload the magazine quickly and using multiple magazines. I don't believe that this particular bill is going to change a thing in Washington.
I do want to bring up to the group here, there was a CDC study in 2004 on the 1994 federal assault weapons ban. It found that a 10-round limit on magazines had little to no impact on crime and did not affect multiple victim crimes. If we could have one response on each side, why would it be different if Washington were to implement the same ban? Tom?
Easy answer, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I guess from my perspective, since the law draws the line at 10 rounds, if somebody has the ability to, if they're in a mass shooting situation or mode, if they have the ability to fire off more than 10 rounds, whether it's 15, 20, or whatever the case might be, I think that poses a less safe situation than somebody with 10 rounds. That's the logical thing I can come up with.
Melissa, would you like to respond?
I'm curious how legislating the number of rounds is going to get a criminal to comply. So effectively, this is what I see, is that I'm the person that's going to be concealed carried in an event that something like that were to happen. This young man's going to be that person, and we would engage that target. We would make sure that we could shut it down as quickly and effectively as possible and save lives. If you are going to take the responsibility to carry a firearm, it comes with a code of conduct. It says, I will protect this young lady with my life at all cost. And I want the opportunity to do that in whatever way I see fit. That criminal, if he's got, however many rounds, he doesn't care what that law says. What you're doing is you're tying my hands and my ability to respond. And in a setting, let's just say, one of the things that frustrates me is the gun-free zones, you guys. I mean, how many times do we have to hear we have all these casualties in a gun-free zone? I'm not saying that you can't have a concert venue and no one should take a firearm, but if someone says this young lady's school is going to be made safe and no one's allowed to carry a gun, then somebody needs to protect her. I have to go to the school grounds. I have to drop my firearm out of my purse, put it in my glove box. If someone sees me, now it's in a car, which I can't be responsible for my car and walk inside the school. If someone were to come in that school, I have no weapon. I have no way to respond to this threat for you on your behalf. We have armed guards delivering cash to the bank. Her life is more important than money. That's where I see that we could focus on legislation, and this is fruitless. You're regulating my number of rounds in my firearm, and in a situation where you have to respond, if you look at the records, police, they do more training than anybody. Yet, if you look at a crime scene of any kind where there are firearms involved and they exchange fire, they have all those rounds on them for a reason. Things are happening fast and people are moving and there's a lot going on. And if you run out of bullets, there is nothing you can do. You are just a target.
Right.
Thank you, Melissa. Very quickly, if we could just kind of share any final thoughts. I do want to ask, just in concise response, looking at all of these bills collectively, do you think they infringe on Second Amendment rights?
I don't. Like I said, I appreciate the fact that I was able to go buy a gun, and that's my right. I think that if I could offer a summation about what I think and what my feelings are about everything we've discussed here, and I think you probably share this with me, we just want to keep the guns out of the wrong hands. That's all we're trying to do. That's it. And I just don't like to see, or I don't want to see, firearm commerce become the overriding factor over public safety.
Jeremy, just very briefly.
Yeah, I completely agree. We don't want criminals to have firearms. And both sides of this completely agree on that. How we get there is where we differ on this issue. And these current proposals are not going to change anything.
Well, thank you all again for meeting with us today and having this discussion. Again, this is only 3 of the bills. At least a dozen or more have been proposed in the Washington State Legislature. We have a full list of those proposed bills in the Washington State Legislature posted on KREM.com. You can check out our website to read the full description, and it'll link you to the bill digest as well.